Okay, well, we are now recording. I just switched to my slides momentarily. And whilst that's changing, welcome everyone to our weekly call. I hope you had a sort of a very sort of relaxing, well-earned week rest over the weekend. A reminder of the content of our call today in a moment or two. I'll hand over to, oh gosh, that's a bad start, Cathy with an N, Almond, Mr. Almond, to talk about serve style, and then I'll just touch on some of the more interesting looking sessions from the RIPE meeting that's coming up in a week's time, and I'll just briefly refer to the RSA conference because I sort of ran out of time. Just pulling together some thoughts from that. So I'll just touch on that briefly, and then just time permitting, just sort of touch on some of the recent developments from the last week, etc. So that's the plan for the call, which is hopefully in line with your sort of collective expectations. So let me just stop sharing my screen. I will rapidly fix that typo whilst I hand over to Cathy from ISC, who gave a very interesting presentation couple of months ago now, actually, thinking about it, early February, so 3 months ago, about serve stale, which I thought was interesting. So she's going to not reprise the presentation, but talk around the subject a little. And maybe refer to that presentation amongst other things. So, and we can be so envious of the view from nearer her home as well, on the sort of Cornish coast. So thanks for joining, Cathy, particularly as it turns out it's a public holiday in the UK today, which I'd forgotten about when I set these up. So appreciate you making the time. Over to you.
Thank you. So Andrew asked me to come and talk about serve stale, and originally asked me to do a sort of reprise of my presentation at OARC 44, but I didn't think that that would be the most useful thing for this audience. So what I was attempting to do at OARC 44 is give people a starter and a primer, and then give them the information that they needed to go off and set it off for themselves. But that's not what I'm going to do today. What I am going to do is talk a little bit more about the background and the things that people need to think about. And then hopefully people will ask me questions and I may or may not be able to answer them. So we shall see. So the question right up front, in case you weren't aware of what it is what is actually serve stale? And Andrew, can you post in the chat the links to my presentation that I gave you earlier so that people have got those accessible if they want to look at it?
I will indeed.
Thank you. So serve stale started, let me think when, probably about 10 years ago. It started with a big and successful DDoS against a major DNS hosting service. And it lasted for quite a long time. And during that time, resolvers couldn't reach the authoritative servers that were hosted there. So a lot of the DNS was effectively down, which meant that a lot of the services pointed to by the DNS was down. And there was a great big hoo-ha about it. And people said, this must never happen again. And then people said, oh, these resolver caches, don't they store this information? So didn't they know where they could send people anyway? So could we not sort of have served old stuff rather than failing to serve anything at all because we couldn't talk to the authoritative servers? And so ServStale was born. The big punchline on that one is that stale bread is better than no bread. Several implementations were created. It was one of those features where the code implementations happened before the protocol was actually approved, designed and approved as an RFC. And the various implementations were refined and the draft was refined until eventually it became RFC 8767, which is a lovely RFC actually. because it's one that's evolved in its creation, it is full of recommendations versus, oh, you must do it like this, and this is definitely how it should happen. And there are fewer do's and don'ts and more shoulds and mays in it. And a lot of background explanation as well. So if you are one of those people that finds RSCs a little bit sticky to read, this one's actually quite fun reading. So I do recommend it. So the concept is, if you've got stuff in your cache that is your resolver cache that is out of date, it's gone beyond its TTL, but you cannot get hold of the authoritative servers to refresh it, then you may serve the old answer. So don't authoritative TTLs matter anymore? Well, of course they do matter. They matter hugely, and they're what the authoritative data owners said was how long you should keep this before you go back and get a refreshed or better or different answer. And that's the way it should be. It's entirely up to the DNS zone owner to determine this. So the purists say, but we're now breaking the protocol. Well, what if that refresh attempt fails? What is best for the consumers of the DNS and the services they provide? Now, if you go back to when DNS first started, it always was best effort. Remember, it was UDP before TCP DNS happened, and it was at the application layer to decide what to do if a query to a server didn't get a response. There would be retries, there would be try other servers. So this is kind of, if you think about it, the next step along the way. So, okay, well, I tried to get an up-to-date version of this address and I couldn't, but I happened to have an old one. So, hey, best effort. Let's give the consumer, the client, what it is that they wanted, even though it's old. So, um, so that's what happened. Um, the TTLs do matter because that's the point at which you should try and go back and get a better answer. But if you haven't got it, then give the client what you've got. And this seems to work quite well. There are some areas I think where it doesn't work as well. And I did cover that in brief. I did cover that in brief with a warning actually in my talk, which is, so what happens if you are um, an organization that has chosen to use your DNS as your load balancing? So you will serve short or even zero TTL addresses. And as you need to change where you want to send your clients to the services that are indicated by the DNS, then you change the addresses that you send them to. And then you become unreachable or temporarily unreachable. And caches anyway will cache things and will serve a lot of clients the same address before they go and serve the next one. I mean, how well is this going to work anyway? And if you do become unreachable and the resolvers are serving stale answers, well, your load balancing is out of the window at this point. It's just not going to happen. Um, so the other thing that I also highlighted was that resolver operators hate zero TTL answers and small TTL answers and may well override them, quite apart from anything that happens with serve stale. So the warning in there is, yeah, small and short TTLs probably are not the best idea for content provisioning, which I think we all know anyway, but serve stale is only going to make it worse. So, actually, no, I did have a thought about that as well. This is a challenge to somebody actually for our presentation. So I have just said that short and zero TTLs don't work terribly well for load balancing in modern systems because resolver operators typically override these anyway. I wonder if anybody has done any research or studies on that to find out how well it actually does work. I would love to see a presentation on that. Hey, maybe somebody will.
I
So,
think an interesting point in that bringing it up is that running TTLs too low when you're doing GSLB doesn't make a lot of sense because you might be running those faster than your health check timers. Right. So running a 0 TTL really doesn't do you a lot of good if your health check timers are 5 seconds, for example.
For example, and in any case, are the resolvers actually honoring that 0 TTL? Because a lot of them don't now by default.
Well, that too. And I applaud them for doing such. Nothing should be on 0 anyway.
Yeah. Well, that's my view, but that's not necessarily their view, but interesting.
I
So
can
I would love to
see
see a study on the effectiveness of doing DNS-based load balancing.
I can see also in the chat Ed has commented that short TTLs at least used to cause problems with DNSSEC. And Michael
Ah,
just added can also fail for IoT devices.
thank
So
you.
there's two potential sort of problem areas as well.
And that's before we even get into ServStale and some of the things that other people do with it, which I'll come to later if I remember to. So we've now decided that actually enabling this thing called ServStale is probably a good idea if there is some sort of outage, because then at least, and that's assuming, of course, that the services that the DNS is pointing the clients to are up, even if the DNS is unreachable, and that's a whole other thing. Assuming that you want to have it, well, what kind of things do you want to think about? One of the biggies is how long do you want to keep stale content in cache? Because resolver caches are essentially big, especially if you're a big organization. You look at organizations and they're monitoring their cache hit rates, but cache consists not just of things that are being held there that are popular and being constantly refreshed. Cache also consists of a lot of content that is once or twice time use only. So now you have a strategy that you're going to keep stale cache around for longer. How long are you going to keep it around for, and what is it going to do to the size of your cache? So imagine that say, your spread of TTLs on the content that was in cache already was between, say, 30 seconds and a day. Okay, how long do you want to keep this data around in case something bad happens? Well, a day seems a reasonable length of time, or 12 hours. Suddenly you have added that time onto some quite short TTL records, and you're going to be keeping all of those that might only ever have been used once for an extended period of time in cache. So without even thinking about it or doing any analysis, it becomes fairly obvious that the cache is going to get bigger. So you're either going to have to think about your cache management strategy for what you're going to evict, or you're going to have to run with a much bigger cache. So that's something to think about if you're going to turn this on. I'm looking at Michael Richardson's question. Yes, I can give an example of a one-time DNS reply that uselessly occupies cache. One would be probably open the door to all sorts of things. Pseudo-random subdomain attack, where all of the queries are random and they only ever get made once. So that kind of content is going to occupy cache, but as negative answers. Another type of cache content would be random, genuine queries that are being used for some kind of service validation. And those will be used. They won't be negative, but they will be in cache, and they're probably only going to ever be used once. So that kind of content probably comes back with quite a short TTL and was never intended to persist. But you've turned on ServStale. So now something that would have been there for 20 seconds is now going to be there for a day.
Michael, sorry to interrupt, Cathy, but the piece after that in Michael's query about extending DNS with some cache advice is food for thought, not necessarily aimed at you, but for the DNS community to provide some
I did
cache.
think about that. I also thought very hard about the DNS camel. Because I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice if the authoritative providers could say when they gave an answer, yes, this is its TTL, and yes, I do want you to keep it in cache stale just in case, or no, I definitely don't. That would be another extension to the DNS. I don't know. Something to talk about later, maybe. The other thing that comes into play here, though, is cache management strategies, and what to evict from cache traditionally has been done on a least recently used basis when it comes to cache fall and throwing things out. But there's also a thought now that you could use a different strategy, and Civ is one of those, where if it's only been used once, then the chances are it's never going to be used ever again. So that type of content is also a prime candidate for eviction. So if you can monitor if something is reused or something is not reused. I can't look at the chat at the same time, I don't think.
Yeah, okay, we'll come back to the chat, Cathy.
But we'll come back to that one because I think that's a really interesting thing to discuss, whether the author should determine whether or not something should be reserved for stale or not. That would be a very interesting conversation to have at the end. So anyway, your cache is going to get bigger if you're keeping content. Your cache management strategy matters in terms of whether you're having stale content in cache is going to be useful or not. The other thing you want to think about is how long you keep the client waiting. So client makes a query, it's looking for an answer, it's got its own TTL. Your resolver probably has its own TTL of how hard it tries before it gives up and sends back serve stale. Sorry, serve fail. Serve stale and serve fail. Ooh. Ideally, you're going to want your client not to wait forever or wait for too long, or you are going to want to set a timer, or the other thing you need to think about is how often, once you've decided to serve a stale answer, you actually go back and trigger yet another refresh attempt. So all of the implementations will have things in them, for example, what timer you want to put on the client waiting for resolution to succeed or fail before you send back a stale answer that you happen to have. They'll also have settings in them that say, okay, so we've served this stale once, and somebody else has come and asked for the same thing. Do I go off and refresh right away again and make that client wait too, and the next client and the next client and the next client? Or should I actually set a time limit and say, okay, for this period, I'm only going to serve the stale answers, and when that's expired, then I'll go off and see if I can now reach the auth servers. So that's a thing that you can tweak as well. And there are different defaults in the different implementations. Do you tell the client who made the query that what you gave them was a stale answer? Yes, you can, because there are now EDE extended DNS EDE extended DNS errors. So there are EDE options you can send back to indicate that yes, you served a stale answer. When is enough enough? When is your stale bread now so revoltingly moldy that you should never, ever feed it to anyone ever again? So where do you draw the line on how long you keep the stuff stale in cache, which I covered right at the very beginning, but that's all configurable. What TTL do you put on an answer that you served stale? Did you give it the original TTL? In which case that might have been a day, in which case say another cache that forwarded to your resolver is going to be living with out-of-date data for yet another day beyond what it should have been, or do you send it back a shorter TTL? Most of the implementations have a recommendation and a default of something like about 30 seconds to about 3 minutes, 6 minutes, or whatever. So yes, you want your clients to come back having been given a stale answer, in the hopes that you will have refreshed it and got a better answer later on. So yes, you set a shorter TTL, and different implementations have different ways of doing this. Okay, so The summary is most of this is about the client experience and about managing cache effectively. I did talk, however, about how long you make the client wait. And I have seen in practice examples where you can set the timer on how long the client waits, and you could actually set it to 0. So the way this works is you have a cache hit when the client makes a query, but oh dear, the cache hit is on something that has now expired. Oh well, give them that now and go and refresh it afterwards. And this is the kind of thing that's awfully attractive to ISPs who operate resolvers, who measure how quickly they can get their service to their clients via their provisioning. And by making their resolvers serve stale content first and refresh after, it's like prefetch done the other way around, isn't it, really? They can get the services to their clients faster. And this is the kind of thing that ISPs are monitored on comparatively. I am not sure about this as a good idea, but I do know at least 2 examples of someone doing this, possibly 3 actually. There's another corner case. But I'd like to know what other people think about it. So over to you. Oh, and everybody shuts up at that point.
Well, you've got a few things in the chat.
I'm just looking at that now and pulling it down.
So Ralph
Oh,
isn't a
yeah.
fan, as you pulled out of auth deciding what to serve stale even.
I'd like to know why or how.
I mean, we've seen a lot of attacks recently where kind of like expired records were used to be abused for domain registration or domain takeovers. And I think that attackers would use that to kind of like have a long TTL and say, if you do something, okay, let me be there for an hour, and then they kind of refresh that forever. And what are you going to do with it? I think that decision how long should be left to the resolver. I'm a big fan of the 0 actually, but um, I think also, I mean, similarly what Unbound does, you should only refresh popular records. I mean, it doesn't, if your mom and pop shop dot something goes down and is no longer available, the kind of impact is very low. But for everything that is popular, the impact's very high. And I mean, that's the thing you cited was really a very popular domain, which probably always would have been prefetched. So I think if you kind of let popularity and then do the thing, because sometimes resolution just takes time. And if you, I mean, what are you going to do? Let the client wait for 2 or 3 seconds? That's a bad kind of experience. So just give out the record you have with 0, and then refresh the record with prefetch, and the next client comes around has a proper DTL. Maybe a different record. So I'm very much for that.
And you should actually send it out with, if you're doing client wait of 0, then you should also send the stale answers out with a very short, if not 0 TTL.
No, I think that's our stuff sends out with 0 TTL if we encountered them during prefetch. So that's just, I mean, the next record. And keep in mind, one of the things that we didn't discuss here at all is that when we use about serve stale, we talk about resolvers. But there's a different ecosystem that actually asks, I mean, DNS cache at the macOS level, systemd resolved at Linux, and all of these things also cache.
Oh, yes.
So,
Oh,
so that's
yes.
why I think, I mean, from resolver sending back 0 has really no bad impacts.
So what I have seen is 2-tiered
Mm.
systems where you have an internet-facing resolver and a client-facing resolver. And in Bind's case, and I think in all resolvers' case, because the TTLs are all being counted down in the internet-facing cache, then all of the client-facing resolvers will come back at the same time because it all expires at the same time. So you'll get a bum 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 hit as they all refresh their caches, and then they'll continue to serve those answers back to their clients for however long.
Yeah, I mean, I have opinions about this architecture because the bottleneck will always be the resolver. That's why I think these architectures are not a good idea. But I mean, other people have different opinions.
Mhm.
Again, scanning through the chat, that's maybe an opportunity to suggest, Michael, you put a few comments in. Do you want to expand on any of those or pick up on some of what Ralph just said? Michael Richard, it's two Michaels.
You're talking about me? Hi, does that work?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry, I know I had microphone problems earlier today. Yeah, it just so we have I think one of the biggest risks in the internet is still cache poisoning attacks. I think there's just way too many systems that just aren't they're not even doing the simplest of stupid things. I think DO53 to public resolver is so open for entities attacking you that I think that's a big deal. So I don't know. I haven't read the RFC, but does it have any advice about DNSSEC? And because it seems to me like this is something that it's significantly less risky if you've done DNSSEC validation, and down to the client, even that way. And then I'm also thinking about this other business of, I can't remember what the RFC is several times. This is the serving root. It's where the resolver gets a copy of the root zone instead of asking all the time, right? And
mirrored root, we call it in Bind,
yeah,
but
right,
yes.
Yeah. I know there's like 3 versions of that RFC or something. I always have to look it up. So this almost sounds a bit like, in some ways, there's a similarity, right, between there. What it's you get a copy of the root zone and you cache it forever, right? Even because you basically have infinite TTLs, it's good. And so I begin to think about, are there domains or things where, particularly maybe enterprise operators, like, for instance, they might say, well, I'm always talking to Office 365, so I should never have that out of my cache. It should always be valid, and even when it's not valid, it's operationally critical that we always have it. So do something like similar to the root name zone cache to get that data and always keep it valid is sort of even more active than I think you're describing at this point.
Oh, it's almost like slaving.
Yeah.
Domain slaving, secondarying. It's almost like secondarying the zone, except that some of them are quite, or secondarying some of the records. But would you want to configure that manually, as in say, okay, this is my hit list of really, really critical records that I always need to have in cache, keep them refreshed at all time? Or would you rather have a service that automated deciding that these were critical?
I think that both are good answers. I think that what I would like to see probably, in my super duper web oriented management interface, that's click and point for the guy, is that you get an email, right, from every day that says, these are the hot zones. Do you want us to automatically thing? And he says, yes, okay, or, notices that, I don't know, that it includes a bunch of inappropriate content, and then take some other actions, right? Because this also tells you, what are the hot domains that day at the same time. And that also may be a very useful thing. And what if malware zones show up on that list, right? Ones you didn't previously know about. That may be also an interesting feedback. And you might want to pre-cache NX domains on them, right? Essentially ban them, right? So
how do you know that they're malware? I mean, how do you distinguish goodware from malware on the domains?
You might not, but you might also know this because it consists of, a bunch of random hex characters and, in a TLD that is untrustworthy, or I don't know, right? I mean, I don't know. Ask ChatGPT maybe. I don't know what the answer to that is, but the point is that you may actually have some intelligence that says, oh well, but I noticed this is the thing. Or there's some organizations that they ban Facebook, right? And if that keeps coming up, then maybe the ban's not really working. I don't know. I'm not in favor of that kind of activity. I think it's dumb, but
there are organizations that monitor for malware domains and will provide you with feeds so that you can block them.
Yeah, but then they wind up banning, research on breast cancer, right?
Okay, I wasn't aware that they had a lot of bad hits.
Oh, because it has the word breast in it.
Oh,
yeah.
But
Okay.
that's just banning it because it's got the word breast in it rather than banning it because it's known
very hard
malware.
for organizations to actually know what they're buying, because they typically buy malware plus blah, 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 right? And anyway, so they get into trouble. And I think there's a lot of places where that's a problem. And so
caveat emptor.
Huh?
Caveat emptor.
Yeah, but they're not even competent to figure it out. Public libraries, for instance, they have large bans on content, but it winds up catching all sorts of other things. But at least you'll be able to see what was, maybe there is a domain which is coming up. It's a bizarre one, but it's a workaround for some other thing. You're like, oh, okay. So I don't know. Anyway, the interesting thing is I don't think people get a lot of information or have a way of getting at that most frequently. What are the hot things in my cache? Right. And actually getting that information might actually be very informative to people.
I feel a feature coming on, or at least I feel a discussion and maybe a draft and a protocol thing coming on. I don't know. It feels like a feature rather than anything else to me, but yeah. I don't know. I know our implementation, I don't think gives us a hot hit list. I don't know if any of the others do. But yeah, okay. What else was I going to say? I think I've said the things that I was going to say. I mean, I have a couple of other examples. I was working on a thing actually this weekend that I did at one stage wonder if ServStale in the other ISP DNS resolvers was causing something to work, which wasn't working on the resolver in question I was looking at, because behind the scenes, the authoritative DNS got broken. So it was definitely the authoritative DNS was broken, but the complaint was, well, these other resolvers resolve it just fine. And a little bit later in the day, I thought, I wonder if they had ServStale. So that might have been. So this was genuinely the authoritative DNS people had broken it, and broken it for probably a good reason, but broken it because they didn't know what they were doing. And yeah, I did wonder if ServStale had saved the day, possibly, on those other resolvers.
So maybe timely you came across that this weekend, Cathy. Yeah.
I don't think I would have thought about ServStale had I not been thinking about ServStale, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was irrelevant to the troubleshooting in any case.
I've seen a few comments in the chat sort of linking this discussion with DNSSEC validation to try and mitigate the risk of cache poisoning. I've probably badly summarized or paraphrased a couple of comments, but probably no harm to make the case for the DNSSEC. And it does feel like there's maybe something useful here that could find its way into DNS ops as a BCP, perhaps. I'll throw that out there for people that are more active than I am in DNS ops for their thoughts. Yeah, who knows? Just again, picking up on a different comment, perhaps those people have been in sort of, I think Spain and Portugal. Perhaps ServStale could have been quite helpful with the recent sort of extended power outages.
Assuming that you could get some internet at all.
The problem is that people didn't get. I mean, I think a lot of the server infrastructure actually was running just fine because they all had backup power, but nobody was actually asking.
I heard what was going on and I thought, yes, the cellular towers probably worked for a while. and then their battery backups or their generators just died. And so, yeah, there was no internet anywhere.
From
So, yeah,
apparently SpaceX, I know what I mean. Forgot what it's called.
satellite,
Satellite, yes. Starlink. Thank you, Kurt.
Starlink, yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that Surfsdale would have saved the day on this occasion. I think too much was wrong.
Yeah.
I, I,
Like,
I,
I've not been following it that closely, having thankfully not been directly affected by it. But I guess there'll be some lessons learned. But yeah, you make a fair point, Ralph. If the local link is out, it doesn't matter how resilient the rest of the infrastructure is. If you can't connect, then yeah, tough.
one thing I did ask in my talk in Atlanta was, Surfsdale has been out there and it was originally done for let's cover for this big disaster. And it's been running for a long while, and there haven't really been any big disasters since people have got it. And I didn't think, I have no idea. I'm just a software provider. I'm not running a resolver. I had no idea whether it was actually doing any good and if it was ever being triggered. There is logging. All the implementations have got logging and statistics and things like that. And the question I asked at the end of the presentation was, is this actually doing any good? And where is it doing any good? Because I don't think it's doing any good for big outages. I think it's probably tiding over little blips, maybe BGP blips, whatever, temporary outages getting to something that maybe only last a couple of minutes. And that's probably where it is saving the day, as in smoothing things over. And several people came up to the microphone at the end and said, yeah, we've got the data. It does get triggered every so often, and it does seem to be for little outages, not the big outages at all. And that's where it's helping. Any commentary on that?
Seems to completely tie in with the most recent comment in the chat from Tail about wasn't actually for a big disaster, but was to smooth
Yeah.
over problems with small issues that still led to
Yeah.
customer calls.
And that's what we are also seeing. I mean, we are monitoring how often we do this kind of like requests that are kind of like prefetch extension, as we call them. But it's, I mean, overall the platform a couple of hundreds per second, but it really doesn't matter because it usually just kind of like you give back a stale record, and then it takes 2 or 3 seconds to actually get the connection or something bad back, or maybe a minute or so, and then the world is fine. So
Yeah.
it is
Yeah.
helpful, definitely.
Yeah. I'm waving here at one of the co-authors of the RFC, who probably knows far more about it than I do. Are there any more questions? I think you've got things you wanted to talk about, Andrew.
Yeah. Anyone else with any other sort of comments or questions? I've skated over a few things in the chat just because I was cherry picking things that led most easily into the discussion. So if anything I've skipped over from anyone, because there's quite a few sort of quite good comments, feel free to come in on those. I see a few things from Kurt and Michael and others that I haven't called out. So feel free if you want to bring those to life. That's totally fine.
We opted, by the way, in the bind implementation, not to keep negative answers available for Surfsdale. The logic behind that was a lot of those are the attack content, and why would you want them in your cache anyway? And another reason is, well, if you haven't got it, there's not a huge difference to the consumer at the end of the day between getting a Surfsdale and an NX domain.
I just repasted the original, so the links to the original talk and notes and so on, in case anyone missed those at the start of the presentation.
So what I've put up there, that wasn't up originally. I did put up another slide set that actually has my notes on what I wanted to talk about for that slide. So it works a little bit better as a tutorial for anybody who wants to go off and implement it on their resolvers. And I did go through and I said how to do it on Bind. And then I also said roughly how to do it on Power DNS and on Unbound and Not Resolver. I didn't go and look at anyone else's implementations. What was the most fascinating was, and I meant to say this as well, was that the options that are available and the way they work are almost entirely because of the underlying architecture of the cache in all of those cases. So Cathy bad phrase is there are many ways to skin a cat. There are many ways to implement serve stale, and they're all dependent on the underlying architecture. And so the configuration options all work slightly differently or have different names, but they achieve the same end. But you will want to, depending on what you're running, look at how to do it and what it involves on a specific implementation, because there will be nuances. Oh, the other nuances I didn't go into and that you might want to is what constitutes not being able to resolve something. Is it that you just don't get an answer, or is it that you get an error answer from the authoritative servers? And those will vary between implementations as well.
It's like the more you look into this, the additional complexities rise to the surface, Cathy.
Oh, there are nuances all over. I couldn't possibly go into all of the details of all of the implementations.
Yeah. Well, look, let's perhaps sort of pause there then. I mean, that wasn't bad. I think when we were chatting on Friday, I think you suggested there was maybe 10 minutes worth here. So this goes to show.
I should never be allowed to present anything. I always run over.
Well, I hope that's given people food for thought. I'm pretty sure it has, judging from the flow of comments. Yeah, who knows? Yeah, as I say, I genuinely could see this turning into some form of, maybe BCP type document that could be quite useful. Just based purely on the number of questions and comments from today, if nothing else. It certainly seems like there could be some benefit from some additional guidance. Let's move on there. So, Cathy, thank you for that, particularly on a public holiday. That especially appreciated. Yeah, I think it's certainly given people plenty of food for thought. So I'm sure serve stale will just move up the people's radar a little on the back of this, and that's probably a good thing. So thank you. Right, and obviously you're welcome to stay on or disappear and go do some rowing or something, play with your cat, whatever you prefer.
Gardening.
Gardening, yeah, even that. But whilst you're doing that, let me just reshare my slides, if my mouse will appear. There's my cursor on the screen again, and we'll move on just briefly from serve stale to a couple of other things. I'm just going to firstly, since the RIPE meeting's coming up in a week's time in Portugal, just highlight sort of mainly DNS related stuff that's on the agenda. Starting first with the DNS working group, kind of obviously, which is on local time, which is same as UK time for a change, Wednesday morning locally. A few things there. You can see some post-quantum crypto algorithms in Bind, which Andre is covering. So talk about SPF, DKIM, etc. So BCP or best current operating practice rather for DNS filtering. Updates from the recent DNS hackathon in Sweden, and a sort of general update from the RIPE NCC. So plenty of DNS stuff there. And then other things that caught my eye, Leslie Daigle is giving an update on finding and fighting hidden attack traffic. Microplastics of the internet, as she's titled it, which I think is quite a creative title. Also in the measurement session, so that's a plenary on Tuesday, also on Tuesday in the afternoon, in the measurement and tools session, there's who actually is, just helping to finding the companies behind the networks. Topic we've covered on this call sort of previously with RDAP. The security working group, there's a piece there on maliciously registered domains and characteristics and abuse, or identification and abuse characteristics of batch registered GTLDs. Sort of loosely picking up on something which came up on the call just now. And then Vicky is doing a piece on money and open source sustainability on Thursday late morning, and also Andre again doing a piece on Bind 9. So that's got interesting sessions there. And then finally, BOF late Thursday on Know Your Customer measures to improve the quality of RIPE registration data. So a few bits and pieces there sort of scattered throughout the week, as I say, the main one being the DNS working group, but there's a few other things as well. It should be an interesting week. There's plenty of other stuff, but I've just cherry-picked things that will be more likely to be of interest to people on this call. There's obviously a load of other things throughout the week for those of us that are there. As I said at the start of the call, I didn't have time to pull out properly structured thoughts and highlights from last week's RSA Conference in San Francisco. But AI was sort of prevalent throughout the week, particularly agentic AI came up frequently. The NSA and CISA weren't present because of guidance from the US executive, but some of their former directors of CISA and NSA and others were there. So people like Ed Joyce and Chris Krebs were there giving some really interesting talks on some of their take on the threat landscape. And there were a couple of DNS specific sessions which I'll summarise properly on a call in the next couple of weeks. I won't try and do that now. And then, as always, some good stuff to close the week, which this time featured DJRE, Jazz Mafia, and Jamie Foxx for no reason other than I think Hugh Thompson, the chair of the programme committee, likes them. So why not? And you've got 44,000 people there. I guess the budget means you can do some interesting things. But as I say, I'll give you a more structured call out of things from there in a couple of weeks' time on the call. Other things, continuing coverage on the NIST secure DNS deployment guide draft, which Ross and Cricket talked about on this call last week. So, and a reminder, you got to the 26th of May if you have any comments on that. Nice bit of research from the DNS Research Federation, homing in this time on registrars and where the problematic ones are when it comes to DNS abuse, and some of them are getting pretty high percentages of abuse. I think the highest I remember from scanning the research was over 600%, which is pretty impressive. They hired some in particular in Hong Kong and China that were especially problematic in that regard. So that's worth a look for those of you that are interested in DNS abuse. And since the topic of domain generation algorithms was touched on, And when we talk about serve style just now, again, there's a nice piece from DNS Filter talking about malware that uses domain generation algorithms to automatically generate the domains, and just highlighting that they're becoming a lot more sophisticated. So it's a lot harder to spot. They're not using predictable patterns in the way that perhaps they did when this first surfaced as a practice. So they are becoming increasingly difficult to detect and block in the way that they're formed. And they gave some examples of that in the report. And then a reminder, if you haven't seen it, ITF 125 has been confirmed for Shenzhen in March of next year. So we're waiting for confirmation of that. And also OARC 45, there's a call for contributions, which is now open. That's taking place in Stockholm in early October. So you've got a little bit of time to put forward proposals for that. I can't remember the date offhand, but it's on the slide that's coming up shortly. And then a whole bunch of other stuff of interest, which we don't have time to go through. But those of you that get the weekly email, there might be a few bits and pieces in there of interest to you. There was just things that caught my eye. Then finally, so a few dates that are coming up. If you were thinking of bidding to run the Colombian registry, you've got till tomorrow to put your bid in. And likewise, if you were planning to put yourself forward to join the European Commission's DSA enforcement team, you've got until this Friday, I think that is the 10th, to apply. And then, you can see if you did, the end of July for OARC 45, call for contributions. So you've got plenty of time for that, and a few others coming up as well. As I mentioned on the call last week, we've got a lot of sort of conferences running this month and next. I've already mentioned RIPE in a week's time. So if you are there, let me know. It'd be good to meet up a few people in person, and we're not so far from the Internet Governance Forum in Oslo at the end of June. So and lots of stuff in between, as you can see, including the ICANN 83 meeting in Prague, amongst many others. So that's probably it from me. As I say, if you're in Lisbon for the RIPE meeting, let me know. It'd be good to meet up in person. But if you're not there, we won't have a call this time next week. So apologies in advance if you join the call. Yes, I can see in the chat, Kurt. Yes, and I remembered you saying you were there as part of the non-com. So, and Vicky, as you're giving a presentation. So yeah, people around on the through the week, but particularly on the Monday evening. Let's see if we can find some time to meet up in person and sort of chat face to face for a change. That's pretty much it from me, other than saying thank you to DNS OARC for sponsoring the call, which is very much appreciate their support. But at this point, I'll stop sharing and see if anyone else has got anything else you want to mention before we wrap the call up. So anything else that is on people's minds at the moment? And if so, pop it in the chat or just unmute and talk, whichever's easiest for you. Not like anyone's typing. I don't think anyone's unmuted.
Oh, I see. Ross is on the call. I just wanted to say I read the NIST secure deployment paper. I thought it was excellent, and thank you very much for putting in the work.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
But it seems to be getting a lot of interest from what I've seen, Ross. So at least people are paying attention, which is a good thing. Definitely well very much needed after more than a decade. Definitely well past its sell-by date in terms of serve stale. That was definitely in need of an update. So yeah, great to see you and Cricket stepping forward to sort of pick your respective pens up on that.
Yeah, it was great to be a part of it.
Okay, I can't see anything else. So on that note then, we're just pretty much on the hour. So thank you everyone. I hope that was useful. Particularly thank you to Cathy for educating everyone about serve stale, and have a fantastic week, and hopefully see some of you in Lisbon next week. So see you then. Thanks everyone. Have a great week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.